So, all weekend long, we have been hearing from the three of you and many others regarding some really amazing stuff. And I think that probably many of us have come up with thoughts, questions, comments regarding really where the rubber meets the road for a lot of this. And so I think that's probably one of the major points of this panel discussion, is to hear from you, your thoughts, your wisdom, your experience regarding how to live these things out that we've been talking about all weekend. And once again, a reminder for all of you, you can just text a question you've got to this number, and if we have time, hopefully we'll get to most or even all of them. So I'm just going to kind of start you with hopefully what's a little bit of a softball. Some of these are going to be specific for each of you as individuals. Some of them are more the type of question where one of you might comment, and if any of you, the others, have something else to add, we can do that as well. But for starters, can each of you maybe share a time when someone spoke the truth in love to you that shaped your life? And specifically maybe when a time where you were challenged with the truth and it changed the way that you acted or thought. Because I think at times it can be easy to hear someone speaking the truth in love if they're in agreement with you. So can you maybe share a time when you were challenged and it changed the way you acted or thought? I don't want to punish any of you by making you go first.
It's not a punishment. Yeah, I had an interesting experience where one of the problems with being a pastor is you know too much about people. And you know a lot of details about people's life, and knowledge tends to be power, and you have to be careful with that. And I remember one time, without realizing it, I and the executive pastor had really started, I don't know if it was gossip, but it was talking about things we knew about people in more detail than we should have. And a guy in the church named Mark came by the office once, and he overheard us, and he grabbed me and pulled me in the other room and just started screaming at me. He was so mad that we were gossiping. And I have a habit of, when I'm thinking really hard, I don't look at the person. And he yelled, "You look at me!" And I said, "You may not treat me as a child. I will look where I want to look." And we had a really come to Jesus meeting, and he was right. We were using, and he was doing it in love. He was a little loudmouthed about it, but it was love. And it was, the consequences were pretty severe, because I and my executive pastor started falling apart, because what joined us together was this excessive amount of knowledge about people's lives. And it cost us over time our friendship. The interesting thing is that Mark's son lives with us now. He's my son's one of his best friends, and he wanted to go to college, so Hayden invited him to live with us for 2 years, and then told us afterwards that we would be paying for another kid for 2 years. But it was an interesting situation where Mark was really concerned about our spiritual health, and it was a difficult situation, but he was right to do so.
I've learned that the instruction that we are to treat one another as we want to be treated, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, doesn't always follow. That's not always true. And one of my challenges sometimes is I can come on too strong. And particularly when there is some sort of a debate going on. And I'm convinced, and I'm clear, and I've got good arguments, and I can come on too strong in a discussion. I want to be treated that way. And so I'm treating the other person the way I want to be treated. Give me your best shot. Come on. Give me your... Seriously, give me your best shot. I can be a debater, and I enjoy it, the give and take, as long as it's in a good spirit. But you can come on strong, and I don't mind having somebody come on strong back to me. Wait, you're missing the whole point. Look, that you're wrong. Here's the point, kind of thing. I don't mind that. And so there are times when that's the way I want to be treated. I have treated others that way, only to find that I came on too strong, and they did not want to be treated that way, and they found it offensive. And I've had my chain jerked probably 2 or 3 times through my adult life in settings where I've done that, doing to others what I'm perfectly happy to have someone do to me, and it didn't come off well. And that has really caused me to kick back and be a lot more careful in those settings. I can feel it heating up in the enthusiasm of the moment and the debate and the discussion that I can come on too strong and steamroll people. And that's particularly true when you are in positions of power or authority. And there have been times when I've been in a position of power and authority, but I feel my whole approach is to operate collegially with people. They're actually under my authority, but I think of them as my colleagues in the work. They think of me as he's my boss. And missing that miss, and you come on strong to someone like that, and it's like, whoa, he really came. That's not what I meant, but that's how it came across. And I just learned to have to really guard myself in those moments, and it's come by being called on it on 2 or 3 occasions in significant ways where I was just informed, you just came on way too strong, that was hurtful. Wow, yeah, so I've learned to try to guard that in myself. I don't always achieve it, but.
Probably like these two, my wife is my greatest advocate, but also the one who has been entrusted to keep my head at the right place. Alistair Begg likes to say that wives keep you from being a pinhead or a pumpkin head, just lift you up and sometimes humble you. And so where do I even begin? One thing that she says, and I'm still working on this, is I'm utterly sincere at the pulpit, but sometimes interpersonally I will use humor as a mask, and that I need to, the puns and all of that, that's fine. I enjoy the humor, but just to be real with people interpersonally too. And so that is something I really took to heart and I noticed about myself. Sometimes you don't even notice it about yourself. You're like, I do that, And I was, I think, telling myself I'm trying to make them feel comfortable, but then I realized I think I'm doing it to make myself more comfortable in that setting. So that's something that has helped shape my thinking.
All 3 of you for sharing. Something that I think is a bit of an element, and maybe each of those answers has to do with this next question. I often hear the complaint that church leaders are unattainable above the rest because of their position of authority. How do we address this issue while respecting that our leadership is called to lead and be authoritative? And do so while protecting them from having to be overly vulnerable. That is leaders, I think.
It's challenging for a pastor because you're dealing with a wide range of people, and you have to be careful of being perceived as having favorites. You really need an even-handedness with the sheep, the flock. It's really challenging then. Where do you get your close relationships? Where do you get your accountability? And my tack on that was always to have around me an accountability group that could really keep me honest when I needed to be kept honest, or just a constant feedback group who had the right and the responsibility to guard me and encourage me and hold me up, but also to confront me if I needed to be confronted, to call me on something if I needed to be called on. I just think accountability for people in places of leadership, accountability is a crucial issue. As soon as you see someone, a pastor of a church, for example, who rises above being accountable, no one now is willing to challenge him. Even the board will not challenge. That is danger waiting to happen. And we can all cite examples of it. I think accountability is crucial. So I would say the key thing is for people in leadership to be sure you have an honest accountability group that you're willing to really hear them in your life.
Yeah, it's a hard balance. I try to err on the side of being very approachable, and it takes very different forms. So I will let people address me the way they want to address me without correcting me. So if they want to call me by my first name, that's fine. But there's folks that also want to call me pastor, and I generally won't correct that because I want to let them use that honorific if they think that's important. And then if things need correcting, I generally let people around me that I trust have my back do the correcting. So if someone was disrespectful, I generally will not be the one to correct that. I've always experienced the Lord having people around me that have my back that will do that for me. And that seems to have always borne the most fruit. But I find that people have more apprehension, even I think in our day and age. And so I think I want to invite approachability more often than not.
Great. Okay. This question gets to, I guess, differentiating between different levels of truth, so to speak. So I think in a context like this, it's easy to develop a paradigm that says this is what I or we maybe even think, but how do you differentiate between levels of truth? In other words, truth that you might grumble about versus something you might leave a church over. How do you discern between the most important things that's worth maybe even separating fellowship over? Are there levels of truth?
Well, there's not levels of truth. Truth is truth. But there are things worth fighting for, Jude, and things that aren't worth fighting for. I think you have the history of the church, you have systematic theology identifying what the major things are, the things that should be in your statement of faith. And those are the things that would be determinative, I think, of where I would go to church or whether I would feel the need to argue or confront with someone. But I think we all have our pet peeves. My number one pet peeve is there's no such thing as a literal translation of a Bible. But I'm not going to not go to a church if someone's claiming their Bible's literal. But you have to have a sense of church history. You have to have a sense of systematics to know what is primary and what's the adiaphora, what are the secondary things. I think part of it too is just the clarity of Scripture. As much as we may believe certain things, the question is Scripture absolutely clear on that? The Bible is not clear whether an elder can be divorced or not. It's just not. And you may have strong feelings about it, but if you're honest to the text, you'll know that the Bible is not clear on that. And so you have to follow that.
Yeah, I think the categories for me are points of agreement, points of agreeing to disagree, and then you get to the point where you say, "I'm sorry, this isn't going to work." And knowing where those boundaries are is the key thing. I think Bill's right. Church history is full of these discussions, and the more we know about how it has worked out in the past, elsewhere, or even elsewhere today, the more we have a sense of where those boundaries lie for us. I'm not sure that there is a set boundary between those three categories that everyone would abide by or should abide by. I think in many ways it's a judgment call, hopefully an informed judgment on our part as to what I can agree to disagree on and what, I'm sorry, this is an impasse and it's not going to work. And there are times when that going separate ways is an important thing to do. So I think that's a very painful moment. I think about it in the book of Acts, watching Paul and Barnabas, compatriots, and yet they come to a very sharp conflict and they go separate ways. And Paul winds up having a very effective ministry, obviously, but Barnabas goes off and is blessed in his work in his own way. So sometimes that kind of a parting of the ways is what has to happen. Knowing when that is and what the issues are is a judgment call that I think requires a lot of wisdom and counsel and talking to others and making sure we're not being the Lone Ranger and this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think key for me is clearly there's first tier things that are at the heart of the gospel. There's secondary things and tertiary things. But I think in every case, you still speak the truth with love. And I find we get sucked into the secular culture's conversation of saying the more important it is, it becomes unloving to even bring it up or take a stance on it. And people within the church actually buy that narrative. Especially right now, it's around sexuality and gender identity. The minute you are clear on those things, we're being told you're becoming inherently unloving. And I think maybe because there's been patterns of that for sure in the church, but I think we, even with things that are central to the gospel, can be and should be very, very loving and charitable. I mean, you look at Paul, and he would really rebuke the churches, but don't forget to see those places where he says, beloved, beloved. You know, he's doing these things with great love, pastoral love and compassion. Saints of God, you know, act in accordance with who you actually are. This is not who you are. And so he's rebuking them, but he's calling them back to who they actually are in Christ. So I just think that's the important thing for me when it comes to, you do need to decipher how important it is, but then you're always still responding with love.
So just a slight shift here, because I think that those answers are getting, and it's true, the question was getting, I'm not saying your answers were missing the question, but that's primarily thinking in terms of what's orthodoxy, what are first tier issues within the church versus secondary, tertiary, or whatever. So on top of that, as Christians, a lot of times, this question says, we're better able to speak capital T truth when it comes to cultural issues, or even, you know, issues between us as the church. But we tend to avoid issues that are associated with politics specifically. As Christians, how do we approach speaking Christ's love into political issues specifically? It doesn't say who did you vote for.
Well, okay, so I went to this weekend thing with Rick Hove, and many of you might remember Phil Warren, who's a beloved elder here that passed away several years ago. And it's leadership lessons using biblical principles, but also events from the Battle of Gettysburg. And at one point, the guy leading it was talking about the principle of differentiation as a leader, that a leader needs to stand above the fray, and that gives great confidence, especially when the troops are nervous. So these Civil War generals would often mount their horse and ride in front of the troops before the battle, even though they're very up and invisible on a sitting target, because they need to symbolically say to the troops, I feel good about this. And I think this is a really crazy, complex moment we're in America. And I think one of the helpful things is for church leaders, spiritual leaders, the elders, the pastors, is to be able to, with all the verbal and nonverbal communication, be able to kind of differentiate and keep their heads about them, because so many people around you are losing their heads. And you see it on Facebook and Twitter and all of these other places. So I just think that's a starting point, is keeping your head, so that you can begin to even speak into this, so that, you know, people can kind of calm down and listen.
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult because of the complexity of the issues, and oftentimes there isn't a clear-cut Christian answer, a biblical answer that's a chapter and verse type answer. Well, if you just obey the Bible, then you have your answer. It's not that simple. And therefore, to wade into it when you don't have a clear sound of the trumpet yourself, or cannot give a clear sound of the trumpet, it seems to me what we're looking for in those moments, I've had a couple of them recently, where sometimes you have to wade into it, or you should at least. But the idea is to give a clear sound of the trumpet where you can. I just published an article in Christianity Today a month ago on the culture wars and this whole thing of evangelicals voting for Trump. The standard position or standard accusation about this so-called 80% of evangelicals who voted for Trump is that they've sacrificed their moral principle. And to do it, they were all up in arms about Clinton and the White House and the Oval Office, and where character counts. And now they've sacrificed that, and here they are supporting Trump. And the whole point of the article was to call that analysis of the situation into question, and to say, wait a second, that's a very facile, in fact, a mistaken understanding of what's really going on. Here's what's really going on. Here's the larger issue that is at stake that explains, in effect, this kind of support for someone, a man such as Donald Trump, for whom, well, I'll leave that alone, but a very, very difficult issue. And to see evangelicals supporting sort of no matter what he says or does, I mean, it boggles my mind to see that. Having said that, I voted for Trump, and it has to do with the alternative. And the point of the article is to say, look, it's not enough to say, look, list all of Mr. Trump's liabilities. How can you vote for that? The question is, well, what choice did I have? It was either that or it was this. And the article lays out the this. And I referred to it as a Sophie's choice. You know, Sophie's choice was this woman in William Styron's famous novel and in the movie who was in a Nazi concentration camp, who was forced to choose between which of her two children would die. One was going to die, and she had to choose which one it would be, her daughter or her son. That was Sophie's choice. We had, evangelicals, point of the article is, we had the mirror image of a Sophie's choice. Sophie had to decide which of two wonderful things would die, and we were having to choose which of two awful things would live. That doesn't turn either of them into good things. It's a lesser, that article was put out there, and I can't tell you, here in the midst of all this confusion about Trump and evangelicals, I haven't had one word of pushback on that article. And what I have had is again and again and again, people saying, thank you for bringing some clarity to this. And challenging this, evangelicals just blown off their moral conscience. Some may well have, but I can tell you there are a lot who haven't. But they were facing a moral dilemma in a broken world that doesn't often give us a choice between pure and good and evil. It gives us a choice between bad and even worse, very often. And we don't have the luxury of not choosing. And I laid that out in the article in such a way that the response has been tremendous and helpful to a lot of people. And I haven't had anybody come back and say, well, here's what you're missing. That's not to say that they won't or didn't feel it. It hasn't been communicated back to me. Here's a complex issue in which I attempted to give some sort of discussion that would clarify the issues. A few years ago back, Wheaton went through this whole thing with Larissa Hawkins and the whole, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And it was an absolute mess and a debacle for the college and all of that. I published an article in Christianity Today giving a definitive answer, in effect, to that question. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And not one bit of pushback. I mean, here's out of the national publication, not one word of pushback. Christianity Today didn't get it. And time and time, I've heard people say, thank you for that. Finally, some clarity out on the web. This was an absolute chaos. And you bring some clarity to it, and people thank you for it. You're thinking as a Christian, thinking biblically, and laying it out in a biblical way. And there is a way often to do this, to bring some clarity and grace to a situation. If you can do that, that is really worth doing. I can tell you from experience.
I think I'd encourage people not to think on party lines. You just can't go with the party. You can say, I'm a Republican, so I'm going to vote Republican and accept everything, or I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to vote Democrat and accept their platform. Unfortunately, we are in a day and age where I don't know if we'll ever have another good person running for president. I don't know if the political system will allow a good person into that position. But I just encourage people is you have to look at what they stand for, the kind of Supreme Court justices they'll appoint, what kind of laws they're going to push, and you got to separate character from their platform. And that's kind of non-biblical. It's not kind of, it's totally non-biblical, because character and what we believe and what we do are tied. But in this day and age, it is a negative Sophie's choice.
Along those lines, I think that a lot of this room, a lot of our community around here is extremely tied into the scientific community. And so there's a question here regarding the ability for Christianity and science to work together to restore acceptance of the existence of objective, couldn't get that out, truths. So as we were talking earlier, there's a questioning in our society about the objectivity of most things right now. So simply put, is there space, and how do you see science and our faith working together to restore some acceptance of objective truth?
Not for hundreds of years. I think that ship has sailed. And these things will take a long time to come back around. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that most scientists no longer believe in any form of Darwinian evolution. I mean, they've said it over and over and over again in private. They can't say it in public or they'll get fired. And so there's all these other things going on that's controlling that intersection of faith and science. And I think, as you look at the history of cultural movements, it's taken hundreds of years to get to the point where the perception is that there is no longer objective, verifiable facts or truth. And it took hundreds of years to get there, and it'll take hundreds of years for that to shift, I think. I'm not optimistic.
I wish I were that optimistic. I'm not sure it will go back. I'm not sure there's grounds for thinking it will go back. I do think this is where we're called again and again to worldviewish thinking and realizing what's really going on. There's nothing inherent in science that is somehow problematic for Christians in the Bible or vice versa. The problematic is the philosophical materialism that often passes for science. That's not the same thing. And yet it's built into. I was talking to some folks this week about this series I just watched on our public television on the planets. It's a marvelous series, from Venus and Mercury all the way out to the distant icy rocks out past Jupiter and Saturn and so on. It's fascinating to look at these planets on there. But the entire working assumptions of that are this radical materialist worldview of that entire discussion. They just inform it, it's taken for granted, and they make statements based upon that worldview, just like that's gospel. And I think that's where the problem comes for Christians. It's that underlying, the material world is all that exists. Carl Sagan in his famous series on the cosmos, that's the way the whole series began. The material world is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. It's a profoundly unscientific statement, and yet that was the premise of the entire series. It continues to be. Well, that's where we bump into things, but it's the worldviewish philosophical stance underneath it. It's not science per se. Science itself is unproblematic for Christians. So I think in one way or another, when we see ourselves in the potential conflict, recognize that it's the philosophical presuppositions that are causing the problem. And the irony of it is those philosophical presuppositions are perfectly arguable. A materialist view of the universe is perfectly arguable by a materialist, but don't call it science. That's philosophy. And to just pull it into science and make it as if science and that materialist philosophy is just all part and parcel of the same thing is really unscientific. And that's why you can have very competent scientists who are not materialists. It's because they're not the same thing. So somehow recognizing that's the difficulty and then maneuvering in the discussion somehow in the light of that's what the real problem is. And then it's a constant judgment calls as to how to do that maneuvering. But in any given moment, any given conversation, any given grappling with what you're seeing or hearing or reading, recognize that the real problem is the materialist worldview when that is being brought in and passed off as science.
So with that, I guess you could just say realistic look at the landscape there. Could you comment about, I'm sure that there are some scientists in this room who are thinking, well then how do I speak the truth into that environment? You were just speaking about it right at the end of your comments there, Dr. Litfin, but maybe to encourage them in particular, that sounds very bleak, even if it's realistic, but how does somebody in that setting speak any kind of truth if they're so against what we see as truth?
I at least am leery of jumping into that because not having had to do that or had to live in that setting, the idea that I've got some experience in bridging that gap with folks who are committed to this materialist worldview, and now my job is to somehow communicate. That is very tricky business, and I wouldn't think of dictating. You have my full support and encouragement as you seek to live for Christ and be faithful in speaking the truth in love in that setting. Part of what I was doing yesterday, in fact, the essential part of in that open plenary session was to recognize again the worldviewishness of what we're dealing with. The nature of the verbal code and using the verbal code, by the way, Bill, I'm talking about language systems. You said language is not a code. Well, it's not a Morse code type thing, but it is a language system, just like a computer language and people writing code in a computer language. We are encoding things in this language system. I'm using the word code a little more broadly there, but having said that, the verbal code, verbal language systems and communicating in a postmodern environment. Capital T truth in a postmodern environment. Love, trying to love people despite profound worldviewish fork in the road differences in how we view the world and the worldview that informs our entire existence and the worldview that informs their entire way of thinking. And we're up here at this level, way out on these forks, trying to communicate with each other when in fact our difference is right here, way back at the fork in the road. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And there's your fork in the road right there. And now we're up here way down the forks trying to talk at each other, and a lot of times not even realizing that, wait, the difference is way back here. It's presuppositional. And yet we're up here trying to find a way in. That's a real problem, real challenge, and I don't want to be sounding like I have answers for how to do that. It's very difficult.
I think if you're in the social sciences, you're at a major disadvantage. Some of you would know better than me, but I think in the physical science departments, you at least are more comfortable with the objective. So I think those are unique things there. And I'm no expert on this, but as I've studied more of the physical side of things and the objections to faith there, it's simply to try and get your friends, colleagues, whatnot, to be honest that empiricism is a worldview, right? I mean, science can't prove or disprove the metaphysical. It's not. So they've taken a leap to scientism, and just to begin to talk about things at that level. But I think it goes back to this morning of, at some point, you're having to trust the work of the Holy Spirit. That there is the work that we do to clear the brush, so to speak. This would be kind of your classic apologetics, but you're clearing the brush so that the clarity of the gospel can make its way in, and you can't convert that person's heart. So you're going to have to find the unique aspects of your environment, how to clear that brush, how to find common ground, things like that.
Is it possible to speak the truth in love via social media?
Yes.
Do you want to say anything more about that, Jay?
Yes. But what we see is ranting. And quite frankly, I find there's a grabbing of a headline, and I wonder how many people actually carefully read the article that they're just forwarding on to other people. I doubt that they often do. This is not rocket science. It's just the think and pray before you speak.
Before you hit send.
What's that?
Yeah. This is pretty simple, but it has a line to it as well. How do you spiritually discern whether you have the ability to teach?
I would say, in a sense, it's fairly simple. It's number one, your own inclination and your a growing awareness of your own abilities and aptitudes and a giftedness, combined with what you're receiving back from those around you. If you're not gifted to teach, that's going to show up pretty quick. I mean, the feedback you get is, this isn't working. This isn't all that helpful. Versus, wow, that was really helpful. Thank you for that. You're a gifted teacher. That really came across clearly to me. The difference in that kind of feedback begins to tell you, maybe I should be doing this and this is good, or maybe I should be doing something else.
I would say, is anyone listening? It's kind of like the test for a leader. You know your leader if people are following. We always have to allow, you get a young student in at Wheaton, a young professor in at Wheaton, and they're going to hit a certain level, and hopefully they'll grow, and so that's the part you're watching, and the student's affirmation and stuff. But if you're not willing to listen, you can really deceive yourself into thinking you're a good preacher or a good teacher. And of course, the problem with preaching is that you get all these people at the back door go, oh, such a wonderful sermon. I always knew when someone says a wonderful sermon, they didn't listen. Because they weren't convicted, or they weren't, just wonderful sermon. It's not intended to be a wonderful sermon. It's God's Spirit's supposed to be working in you for something else. But I just think, I've known quite a few people that feel called both to teaching and preaching ministries, and you just listen to them and you go, you need feedback, because this is not where you belong. You need to be somewhere else.
That's certainly true teaching in a seminary, where you've got these young students coming by you in preaching classes by the dozens over the years. And there's very clearly, some of them are gifted, they're still in the raw, but the gifts are there, you see it, you know it. And there are others, you look at them and think, that's a sow's ear. I don't know how the Lord's going to make a sow purse out of that, and sure enough, they don't wind up doing it. And Bill's right. The feedback you get sometimes as preachers, you're glad for affirming feedback. I'm always grateful when I get feedback. But some of the stuff you get at the back, shaking hands on the way out, that was the best thing since the Apostle Paul, kind of thing. Howie Hendricks used to call that the glorification of the worm ceremony. Standing back there with people telling you what a wonderful sermon it was. And as Bill said, it may not always have felt to you the way it came across to them. The feedback, frankly, if you're going to affirm a preacher, an expository preacher, somebody like Jay, the word that I always want to hear back when I have preached an expository sermon is, wow, that passage really came across this morning. I love that. I'll never read that passage again without having the Lord strike me with that truth. And they're referencing the passage and not the preacher. The moment they're talking about me, I start getting antsy. You're really a gifted preacher. I don't want to hear that. What I want to hear is, wow, that passage changed my life this morning. That is a blessing to the preacher.
I'd like to submit that we start using the phrase sow's ear as code for bad teaching. In a local church setting, let's say there's a situation where you view a theology that's popular or that's held by your church to be biblically incorrect, and you want to see the church orient back to Scripture in spite of peer pressure or pastoral or elder pressure. How would you recommend going about addressing anything like that?
I think you preach it. We had a bunch of preterists invade our church. The preterism is the belief that Jesus has already returned again. And I went to the elders, we talked about it. I got permission for doing what I was doing so I wouldn't be all by myself. And then I preached 3 sermons on Jude, fighting for the faith, and identifying what you needed to believe to be in leadership. The fact that we would never teach something contrary to Scripture or insist on anything outside of the statement of faith. It kind of laid the groundwork. But I just found that by preaching it, and as long as it's really expository, it's really hard to argue against a truly expository sermon, even if the church holds a different position. But again, you have to be wise in this stuff. If you've got a bunch of elders that have believed this other doctrine for the last 40 years, you have to be smart at how you do that and how you work with them and let them know the disagreement and what you're going to be preaching. But I just always found you just preach the truth and let the Spirit do what it's going to do.
Malcolm, answer that question. Are we talking about a pastor coming into a church where there is that kind of difference?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely applicable. I do think that the question is being asked if you don't have a position of power like that, like maybe you're not even on the elder board, or you're certainly not the pastor. Is there a way to bring up the truth in love, what you see as the truth, to the pastor or elders in a healthy way?
My inclination, and I wouldn't pound the pulpit for this, although it's a pretty strong inclination, it would be to say, speak up, as Bill said, speak up, even if you're not in the pulpit, particularly by going to the leadership, challenging the leadership with the truth issues that are at stake. And if you don't get a response, and they're unresponsive to it, you need to be someplace else if this is that kind of an issue for you, because the idea of dividing the church, you sitting out in the pew and you wind up, getting the church divided up into sides. I just, everything in me says, I don't want to ever create that in a church. And if in fact I've done my best through the proper channels of the leadership and it's gotten nowhere, and this church is still representing this position that I take to be seriously mistaken, false, that's a signal to me that I'm in the wrong place, and I'm going to have to turn that church over to the Lord and say, Lord, put me someplace where I can be a blessing. Is that cowardly, Bill?
I was telling you my own experience. We went to a church that was not of the tradition I was used to, and the pastor's a very, very good friend of mine. But it was obvious they're a more charismatic church, kind of primed to respond. Is this being recorded? more primed towards to responding out of excitement than biblical truth. And somebody came up to me afterwards, one of the sermons, and goes, at least some depth. There's nothing worse you could have said to me. And I never preached there again because I wasn't going to divide the church. And we taught Sunday school, and there were 50 people or so that really enjoyed going deeper. But I would never divide a church or challenge a pastor on something like that. Unless I went directly to him and I said, I think what you're doing is wrong. And that wasn't in this case. But it was scary to realize I was in a position to divide a church. And I ran.
Yeah, I would just say, prior to engaging the leadership, just praying over it and being a Berean. Again, we talked about that this morning, of just the more you've thought it through biblically, the better, so that you can come to the leadership and it's not your opinion versus their opinion. It's, can we sit down together with an open Bible and look at this together? That has always gone well. The things where it gets toxic is where it's not really based in the Bible. Lots of emotion. There's certain things that are in our belief system or how we function as a church that people don't like, and they come. And the ones that come with, can we talk about the text? It's very positive and healthy. The ones strong opinion and ranting hasn't gone well.
Can you speak to whether there is a category, and if there is it ever appropriate to, quote unquote, speak the truth in love by not speaking, by not saying something?
Silence, saying nothing, communicating nothing, is ironically an indirect form of nonverbal communication. But it's extremely ambiguous message that's being sent. People may sense something's wrong. This person is not happy about something, but the idea of actually communicating some sort of a message with any clarity by simply refusing to speak and going silent. So in effect, it doesn't strike me as a particularly useful strategy. There are times when you need to go silent, but just as Bill was saying, because you don't want to be a divisive influence. So guard your lips, say nothing, do nothing. And if it's serious enough that you say, but I must do something, then the something is for you to step away. It's not to pour poison into a body and divide that body.
Well, we are not getting to plenty of questions here, and so I'm sorry if your question wasn't brought up, but I'm going to have to cut us off for the sake of time. I want to just go ahead and say thank you on behalf of everybody here to all of you for all you've given. Yes, please. Thank you for taking the time in preparation and being here. Also, thank you to all of our volunteer staff, the planning committee. There has been a lot of work put in before today, last night, this morning, after we leave to make this happen. So again, thank you all for volunteering as you have.
Let me affirm something here too, Malcolm. I want to affirm the folks, all of you who've gathered and become a part of this conference. I find this really encouraging that you come with this kind of subject matter, communicating biblical truth, and all that is involved in it, and the workshops we've done here, that you're here because you're hungry, you're interested in this, you care about these things. I want to say thank you. You're a blessing to me that these kinds of things matter to you. They don't matter to enough believers, this kind of thing across the country these days in America, and that I find that sad. I go back 50 years of being involved in leadership in local churches across the country, and I'm telling you, there's a big difference between now and 50 years ago in the level of interest in just these kinds of things. But you're there, and I encourage you, want to affirm you in it. Keep on going. May your tribe increase.